Hey everyone, just wanted to announce that I am now working with a small local company named People's Choice Companies LLC to sell merchandise and products on Etsy. Consider supporting me and the small company by purchasing stuff on the Etsy store. Link is in the description. I am also helping out with a GoFundMe, also by People's Choice Companies, linked to helping create projects for struggling people. Consider donating to help out with that. Link it will be also in the description. Alright, thanks. Now back to the video. The Nintendo CDI games. Who doesn't know what they are? They're perhaps one of the most infamous Nintendo-related projects in gaming history, just for how complete garbage they are. We all know this stuff. The CDI games play bad, they're underwhelming, and they have these horrific cutscenes present that are the subject to extreme mockery. A lot of which is funny, I should say.
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
My boy.
But we all know about Hotel Mario, Faces of Evil, and Wanda Gamelon. They've been covered extensively. But what about that fourth game, Zelda's Adventure? Yeah, that game exists too. Few really talk about that game, mostly because it's the hardest to get due to being a European exclusive with a high price, and the hardest to make fun of since rather than anime crap, it's live action crap. But Zelda's Adventure is actually a fascinating little game since, much like Mario's Wacky Worlds, the game was an ambitious attempt to try and bring about an impressive Zelda game on the Philips CDI. But due to various problems, what we got was a broken husk of an original vision. So, let's take a look at this game. Today on Beta Quest, I bring to you the beta and development of Zelda's Adventure. Zelda's Adventure began development sometime in April or May of 1992, with a projected release date of November 1993, and was born out of a deal between Philips and Nintendo to develop a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo that didn't come to fruition in the end, and yes, that will still be a subject for a future video. However, from this deal, Philips was allowed to use several Nintendo characters for projects to be released on their own CDI system, and to get these projects made, Philips contracted various developers to create games out of the selected characters. On top of this, Philips was given free reign to use these characters however they wish, with virtually no supervision from Nintendo, aside from character design approvals, which we all saw how that turned out.
Link, I can't give credit. Come back when you're a little, richer.
But in the case of Zelda's Adventure, Philips contracted the studio Viridis, a small studio from California who were known for games like Safety Monkey and Tommy? What are these games? I never heard of them before. But in any case, Philips chose these guys to make another CDI Zelda game, with their stipulations being that they must take full advantage of the CDI's amazing abilities of high quality graphics, FMV cutscenes, and amazing Red Book CD sounds. With these stipulations in mind, Viridis began development, with their plans for a Zelda game being different from Animation Magic's plan. Animation Magic being the studio making Wanda Gamelon and Faces of Evil at the time. And yes, they'll be a subject for another video, don't worry about that. Anyway, rather than create a side-scrolling game in the vein of Zelda 2 like Animation Magic's games, Viridis would create Zelda's Adventure as a top-down game in the style of A Link to the Past, with the goal being to essentially make a realistic-style traditional Zelda game that can push the CDI's hardware to its limits, with a massive adventure that would have over 300 hours of content to go through, featuring at least 600 screens and 160 NPCs to interact with. However, not only would this grand ambition not pan out in the slightest, but the game would also be severely crippled by many of the same problems that affected the other Nintendo CDI games, that being a lack of budget, a lack of experience, and a lack of technology, a la the CDI being a piece of crap in terms of like making games on it. To start off, the CDI was just not really a gaming console, but rather a jack of all trades type of thing that could do multiple things okay to decently, but no one thing especially well. Specifically, it was an interactive multimedia device that could also play games, not so much a specially designed gaming console. And worse yet, the hardware wasn't that great because it had many problems with streaming audio, working with a standard controller that used infrared technology, memory problems, disk problems, graphic problems. Pretty much has a lot of problems, really. However, seeing how the CDI's only selling point was that it could play games, with an asterisk, Philips decided to just market the CDI as a gaming console, when they knew full and well that the CDI couldn't do anything beyond small and simple games. It was clear that even the most experienced developers with the biggest budgets would not have done that well working on CDI's hardware, but at least it would have somewhat helped with the game's quality. Unfortunately, Viridis was not even close to any of that. They were not a very experienced company when it came to developing games, having only a small handful of short and simple educational games under their belts. And there's even interviews of how developers would get frustrated with their colleagues' lack of experience in the game development field. This is pretty clear when you analyze the game closely, such as part of the HUD's counters being unchangeable strings rather than numbers, and very questionable game design choices, such as mazes and stuff like that. Apparently, most of the game was programmed by one person, Randy Casey, with additional programming done by Gavin James, who helped with the inventory and game progress tracking. So, that's a bit of an issue. And to make matters worse, Viridis was given an extremely thin budget to work on this ambitious Zelda project, a commonality among the Nintendo-based CDI games. Even though those were Nintendo-based properties, they should be given, bigger budgets, you think, but I guess not. Granted, there were other accounts that the budget for this game was very large, but I think this may have been a joke or something, as what I will be saying about this game in the upcoming minutes will clue you in on what the budget most likely was. I'll give you a hint, it's very low. As you could probably have seen with your eyeballs, even though you probably would have wished you didn't see it, Zelda Adventure was radically different from Wanda Gamelon and Faces of Evil by opting for live-action digitized graphics instead of animated graphics. In theory, this would not only be awesome, but would also check off the demand for amazing graphics Philips wanted, and it did do the latter, but not so much the former. Sadly, much like the animated CDI Zelda games, a low budget. See, I told you it wasn't a high budget, it was a low budget. But the low budget would severely hold back the developers from properly doing the digitized graphics properly, and it was actually way worse than you think it is. Or was, since this was the 1990s. To get the backgrounds, developers would make use of scenery footage from Viridis' Santa Monica location, aerial footage of Hawaii, and some vacation photos taken from the staff, with buildings and interiors being created as miniature sets and models and then being composited into the background. Unfortunately, these incredible backgrounds would suffer the wrath of the CDI's lack of power, as they unfortunately, I said that twice, but they ate up a lot of the console's RAM, which was responsible for the game's infamous slow scrolling speeds. Worse yet, to make these incredibly detailed backgrounds fit, the developers had to scale them down in order to save up on memory and power, which explains why the graphics not only look really ugly, but also look really strange, like the characters looking like giants or something. I even suspect that due to the way these backgrounds look,
These backgrounds were meant to be huge and feature proper scrolling, like how the backgrounds work in A Link to the Past with the scroll up and down and then you transition to a next screen. You know how the scrolling works in A Link to the Past? Yeah, it works like that. But due to the CDI's non-existent power, they couldn't really pull this off and stuck with the NES style of screen scrolling, but with pretty terrible loading screens, which sucks. But that's just speculation on my part. And what about those digitized character graphics, those infamous sprites? Well, due to the non-existent budget, again, the developers couldn't capture the character graphics properly, which would have involved renting a space with the necessary equipment to cleanly capture the character graphics. No, what they ended up doing was film themselves off of a mirror attached to an ultra-low ceiling with a non-mounted camera, with walk cycles done by the characters walking on treadmills. Well, that last one was probably the only way you could pull off something like that, but still, it's pretty strange if you ask me. However, despite that very unimpressive and strange way to include the human characters, one part that is pretty impressive is that the monster graphics were actually developed using clay models, created by an experienced someone who made clay model monsters in movies, named, I may mispronounce this, sorry, his name is Jason Bakutis, I think. You likely never heard of him, but he did work in movies like Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, and Critters 3, which you likely never heard of either. But his work is pretty good though. I think it's pretty good. One of the few good things about Zelda's Adventure. The music was also a nightmare, as the developers planned to not only make use of ambient sounds and lots of music, but they also want to include some music by the band Echo and the Bunnymen. For some reason, I don't know why. But not only did the lack of budget prevent the music from Echo of the Bunnymen from appearing, but the system's lack of memory would prevent most of the intended and already made music from appearing, and more, as the music that did get implemented ate up more of the memory. And if things just couldn't be bad enough, this massive consumption of memory that the very minimal amount of audio and visuals took up would contribute to Zelda's Adventure's infamous load times between screens. Oh, and the cutscenes and voice acting. They will be played by staff members. They couldn't really hire any real actors, unfortunately, which is why a lot of the cutscenes, well, not a lot, all of the cutscenes and the voice acting sound extremely unprofessional. Now, allegedly, the voice actor for Gaspra, you know, the old man seen here, he was apparently voiced by Hal Smith. You may know him from the town drunk in Andy Griffith and Owl in Winnie the Pooh. I can't really confirm it because I can't really find any source for that other than in Wikipedia and stuff, so take that with a grain of salt. But if so, this has to have been his last bit of work, because he would end up dying before the game even came out. So yeah, if this is true, I have no clue how they managed to get this guy. But okay. But back to the game. And to just pour salt on the wound, all this garbage related to the CDI's non-existent hardware power for games would result in the game being dramatically scaled back, reducing the game to only a handful of NPCs to interact with, couple dozen screens to explore that are way smaller than planned. Again, that part is speculation. And a game that amounts to only about 8 to 12 hours of total gameplay. A major far cry from that original plan of 300 hours and hundreds of screens and so many NPCs. Darn. I mean, The game's development was a complete disaster, but the insanity of Zelda Adventure's development was not over yet. Surprisingly, despite all that nonsense with the project being dramatically scaled down, all that hardware stuff and all this other garbage, Zelda Adventure was actually completed pretty quickly, being completed in spring of 1993, about a year or so after development began, with early builds being sent to Philips for feedback and approval, as well as other entities to get some promotional material ready. Well, I say completed, but in actuality, Philips would send the game back for further modifications and bug tests, and what would happen would be a very bizarre and multi-part 2-year testing period that would result in the game being forced into being delayed for many years. This was due to Zelda's Adventure being highly buggy and needing to be fixed up by a much smaller staff due to Viridis laying off most of the original team after the game's completion, as well as needing to add more trademarks and copyright information, as well as needing to cut and modify even more content from the game. During this period, the game would be advertised in many magazines and would eventually gain a player's guide, found in Dutch gaming magazine CD Interactief, I don't know how to pronounce it, with a full version released in the 1999 issues, for some reason, and because the player's guide and magazines were based on a much earlier build of the game, the guides and magazines mention many things that aren't in the game, such as locations that don't exist, items that don't exist, and enemies that don't exist. In 1995, the game would officially be finalized and ready for retail, although the game would not see an official release until 1996, likely to strengthen the CDI's 1996 lineup as a European exclusive. Yes, although the game was advertised in North America extensively and ready to be released there, Zelda Adventure would not be released in the United States. This was likely because by 1996 the CDI was pretty much dead, and it would have likely been just a waste to really bother with an American release for Zelda's Adventure, so they decided to just cut their losses and keep the game as a European exclusive. This is why finding a physical copy of Zelda's Adventure is much harder compared to Wand of Gamelon and Faces of Evil. But anyway, the game was released in May 10th, 1996. I want you to guess the reviews of the game and the sales success. I'll even give you multiple choices. I know, right? Isn't that weird? This game that had all these problems and still had more problems, it failed? How could a game like this fail? Well, the game failed and was bombed by critics for its terrible gameplay, terrible graphics, terrible game design, terrible music, or lack thereof, and the horrific load times. And didn't really sell all that well. Man, that's so shocking. I can't believe it. Granted, it's kind of unfortunate, since it really seemed like Viridis did want the game to succeed and be the best it could have been, but the CDI just killed the project. But, whatever happens. It's over. Regardless, we have one more thing to go over, and that's all the beta stuff and the stuff that's in the game but isn't used. So let's go over that. Surprisingly, there is a lot of unused content that is still within the files of Zelda's Adventure. Within the game, one can find a slew of unused graphics and maps, most of which were likely supposed to have been used, but the file and game is so buggy and broken that they likely were accidentally unused because of that. Yeah, they they didn't really finish the bug testing. I'm just saying. There's also a slew of unused items, such as the vial of acid, alligator shoes, fishing nets, hourglasses, and an orb. A good chunk of these items have their functionalities removed and are useless, but we do know what a few of them would have done because of pre-release info, and actually some of them still have their functionalities intact. For example, the alligator shoes would have been a situational item used to access the swamp of Vendos, I think, and the hourglass would have been similar to the clock in Zelda 1 and slow time down, making it easier to kill enemies. Why these items were cut, I don't really know, but I mean, it's not like Zelda's Adventure is short on items, am I right? Moving away from that, there's also a humongous amount of voiced lines in the game, with the final only making use of 1/3 of all the dialogue, such as boss damage dialogue, cut tutorials, more lines for other characters, to even lines potentially referencing a scrapped morality mechanic, where Zelda could be an asshole to people by not being charitable, refusing to quench people's thirst or hunger, and even beat people up. Damn, Zelda's Adventure was way more ambitious than I thought, and Zelda could have been quite a jerk. Maybe that is why that morality dialogue was cut, or maybe the CDI was just shit, I don't know. There's also some cut music, but all that was found were 2 tracks plus a copy of another song. I have a sneaking suspicion that there were far more tracks that were recorded that we don't really know about, but that's just suspicion. Surprisingly, there is an early prototype of Zelda's Adventure, although the differences are not really that significant. Only some text differences and some minor adjustments to maps, although what I also find funny is that in the prototype of the game's intro, Ganon's name is spelled correctly on the Scrolla Shermack, or whatever it's called, but for some reason this had to be corrected to the misspelling in the final version. You know, I guess someone just thought the spelling in the awful Zelda 1 translation was the correct spelling. Who's to say? The prototype also includes one of the cut items, the alligator shoes, but in this version the shoes would have just allowed Zelda to walk her normal speed in the swamp of Vendos. What a useful item, am I right? Speaking of prototypes, according to CD Interactive's Guide of Zelda's Adventure, which uses a much earlier prototype than the one we got, there were some alternative item locations, enemy placements, character placements, as well as references to some of the unused items mentioned, like the aforementioned alligator boots, or shoes, I don't know what I keep calling them, I don't care, and the vial of acid. But that's about it. And on a final note, while not technically unused, there is an Easter egg in the game that references one of Viridis' unreleased projects, Food Dude, where using a specific item in a specific area will cause the game's main hero to appear. Apparently, Food Dude, a basic auto-scroller in 2D where you dodge unhealthy foods, was cancelled for being a pretty trash game. And aside from this screenshot, this Easter egg is all that remains of the project. So, that's cool. But that was Zelda's Adventure. It's kind of unfortunate that Zelda's Adventure turned out the way it did, because it seemed like Viridis really wanted to try and make this the true CD Zelda game, a grand scale CD version of A Link to the Past with Mortal Kombat looking graphics, and it was like realistic, and it was like so big and huge, and there's so much you could do, only for the CDI to destroy the whole thing. You can see a good idea for a Zelda game in this thing, but the CDI just can't seem to handle good games that are slightly complicated. Sure, it can manage some educational games, arcade-style games, and games resembling a flash-up version of an old PC game, but anything resembling something larger like a complex platformer or action-adventure game, the CDI would just implode on itself. And to just see the game being further pared down to just make the whole thing somewhat function, damn, I mean, Zelda Adventure was such a train wreck. But tragically, games torn apart due to hardware limitations is not an uncommon thing in video games, and we'll see more examples throughout Beta Quest. But until then, this is K-Steel of Beta Quest signing out. I will see you all later.
This was a Cobalt Steel video by MS Bernie. Like, comment, and subscribe if you liked what you saw. Until next time, see you all later.